Welcome to our detailed journey through one of the most pivotal periods in American history, the Civil War. This conflict not only shaped the future of the United States, but also redefined its very identity. Today, we'll explore 10 defining moments that defined this era. Let's begin with the first shots fired at Fort Sumpter. In the early months of 1861, tensions between the northern and southern states had reached a breaking point. The election of Abraham Lincoln, a staunch opponent of the expansion of slavery, ignited fears in the South that their way of life and economic interests were under threat. 7 southern states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president. Fort Sumpter, located in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, was a Union stronghold in the heart of the Confederacy. As secession took hold, Confederate forces demanded the fort's surrender. Major Robert Anderson, the Union commander, refused. On April 12, 1861, Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumpter, marking the beginning of the Civil War. The bombardment lasted for 34 hours until Major Anderson, his supplies exhausted, surrendered. The fall of Fort Sumpter galvanized both the North and the South. In the North, there was a surge of patriotic fervor, with calls for volunteers to join the Union Army. In the South, the successful attack was a source of immense pride. Both sides prepared for a conflict that they believed would be short-lived, but would instead drag on for 4 brutal years. Following the skirmish at Fort Sumpter, both the Union and Confederate armies began to mobilize. The first major confrontation came on July 21, 1861, near the small Virginia town of Manassas, close to a creek called Bull Run. Union forces, led by General Irvin McDowell, marched from Washington, D.C. with the aim of capturing the Confederate capital at Richmond. They encountered Confederate troops under Generals Joseph E. Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard. Early on, it seemed the Union had the upper hand. However, Confederate reinforcements arrived, turning the tide. The battle culminated in a chaotic rout of Union forces who fled back to Washington. The Battle of Bull Run shattered any illusions of a swift victory for either side. The Union, humiliated and shocked, realized that the war would be long and grueling. The Confederates, buoyed by their victory, gained confidence. Both sides began to prepare for a prolonged and bloody conflict. In September 1862, Confederate General Robert E. Lee embarked on an ambitious campaign to invade the North, hoping to sway European powers to recognize the Confederacy and to encourage the Northern peace movement. His army crossed into Maryland, aiming to strike a decisive blow. On September 17, 1862, Union forces under General George McClellan met Lee's army near Sharpsburg, Maryland, by Antietam Creek. The battle was fierce and fragmented, with fighting erupting in locations that would become infamous: the Cornfield, Dunker Church, and Burnside's Bridge. By the end of the day, over 22,000 soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing, making it the bloodiest single day in American military history. Though tactically inconclusive, the Battle of Antietam was strategically significant. Lee's invasion was halted, and he withdrew back to Virginia. President Lincoln seized the opportunity to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared the freedom of all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory. This transformed the war into a fight not just for the Union, but for human freedom. By mid-1862, the Civil War had raged for over a year, with no clear end in sight. President Lincoln, recognizing the need to redefine the Union's war aims, prepared a bold and transformative measure: the Emancipation Proclamation. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were to be freed. Although it did not immediately free a single enslaved person, it fundamentally altered the nature of the war and ensured that a Union victory would mean the end of slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation had profound effects. It discouraged European powers from recognizing the Confederacy, as many had already abolished slavery. It also allowed African Americans to join the Union Army, bolstering its ranks with motivated and committed soldiers. The war was now unmistakably a fight for human liberty. In the summer of 1863, General Lee launched a second invasion of the North, hoping to relieve pressure on Virginia and score a decisive victory on Union soil. His army moved into Pennsylvania, culminating in a three-day battle at the small town of Gettysburg. From July 1st to July 3rd, 1863, Union and Confederate forces clashed in the fields and hills around Gettysburg. The battle saw fierce fighting at places like Little Round Top, the Wheatfield, and Cemetery Ridge. The climax came on the third day with Pickett's charge, a massive Confederate assault that ended in devastating losses. The Battle of Gettysburg was a turning point in the Civil War. Lee's army was forced to retreat back to Virginia, never again to mount a major offensive. The Union victory bolstered Northern morale and marked the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. Later that year, President Lincoln would come to Gettysburg to dedicate a cemetery for the fallen, delivering one of the most famous speeches in American history. While the battle raged at Gettysburg, another crucial campaign was unfolding in the West. Union General Ulysses S. Grant aimed to capture Vicksburg, Mississippi, a fortress city that controlled the Mississippi River. Grant's campaign began in May 1863 with a series of maneuvers and battles that isolated Vicksburg. For over a month, Union forces bombarded the city, cutting off supplies and reinforcements. The citizens and soldiers within Vicksburg endured relentless bombardment and starvation. On July 4, 1863, the day after the Union victory at Gettysburg, the Confederate garrison at Vicksburg, commanded by General John C. Pemberton, surrendered to Grant. The fall of Vicksburg gave the Union control of the Mississippi River, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two and securing a crucial strategic advantage. The capture of Vicksburg, coupled with the victory at Gettysburg, marked a turning point in the Civil War. It boosted Northern morale and dealt a severe blow to the Confederacy. President Lincoln famously said, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea," highlighting the strategic importance of the Union's victory. In the months following the Battle of Gettysburg, the Union sought to honor the fallen soldiers with a national cemetery. On November 19, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln was invited to deliver a few appropriate remarks at the dedication ceremony. Lincoln's Gettysburg address, though brief, profoundly encapsulated the war's deeper meaning. In just 272 words, he reaffirmed the principles of human equality enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and redefined the Civil War as a struggle not just for the Union, but for a new birth of freedom that would bring true equality to all of its citizens. Though initially met with mixed reactions, the Gettysburg Address has become one of the most revered speeches in American history. It continues to inspire generations, emphasizing the ideals of democracy and human equality. In the fall of 1864, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman embarked on a bold and controversial campaign to cripple the Confederacy's war effort. After capturing Atlanta, Sherman proposed to march his army to the sea, destroying everything in their path to break the South's will to fight. Starting in mid-November 1864, Sherman's forces moved southeast from Atlanta toward Savannah. They practiced a strategy of total war, aimed at destroying not just the Confederate Army, but also the South's economic and civilian infrastructure. Railroads were torn up, crops were burned, and supplies were seized. By December 21, 1864, Sherman's army reached Savannah. The city surrendered without a fight, and Sherman offered it to President Lincoln as a Christmas gift. The march devastated the South and demonstrated the Union's overwhelming military power. Sherman's march to the sea was significant for its psychological impact. It demoralized the Southern population and eroded the Confederacy's ability to sustain the war. It also showcased the Union's strategy of total war, signaling the inevitable defeat of the Confederacy. By early 1865, the Confederate forces were in disarray. General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, once the pride of the Confederacy, was exhausted and outnumbered. Union General Ulysses S. Grant had relentlessly pursued Lee's army through Virginia, aiming to end the war. On April 9, 1865, Lee's army, surrounded and out of supplies, was forced to surrender. The meeting between Lee and Grant took place at the McLean House in the village of Appomattox, Virginia. Grant offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers were allowed to return home with their personal possessions, horses, and sidearms. The surrender at Appomattox effectively ended the Civil War. While other Confederate forces would surrender in the following weeks, Lee's capitulation marked the collapse of the Confederacy. The terms Grant offered helped to begin the process of reconciliation and healing for a divided nation. As the nation began to celebrate the end of the Civil War, tragedy struck. On April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, President Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. During the performance, Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth entered Lincoln's private box and shot him in the head. Booth leaped to the stage, shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants," and fled the scene. Despite the best efforts of doctors, Lincoln succumbed to his wound the following morning. Lincoln's assassination plunged the nation into mourning. His death not only robbed the country of its leader, but also complicated the process of reconstruction. Lincoln's vision for a lenient and compassionate reintegration of the Southern states was left to his successor, Andrew Johnson, whose policies would prove contentious and divisive. The Civil War was a defining chapter in American history. It resolved fundamental questions about the nature of the Union and the future of slavery, laying the groundwork for a new America. The legacy of the war continues to shape the United States, reminding us of the sacrifices made for freedom and equality. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the key moments of the American Civil War.